Okay, first of all, I'm Sarah Monette. I write as Katherine Addison. I have a new book out this summer, The Angel of the Crows. Secondly, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of your pandemic defiant response to no in-person meetings. I think it's a great idea and I'm glad to be a part of it. I'm going to read from The Angel of the Crows, and we'll see if any of my cats come to help. I'm going to read chapter 2, not because chapter 1 is unimportant, but because in chapter 2 our two protagonists meet for the first time. The narrator is Dr. J.H. Doyle, who has been injured horribly in Afghanistan and come back to London, where things are going not as smoothly as one might hope. Chapter 2, a meeting in St. Bartholomew's Hospital. London is no place for an invalid, nor for anyone required by the exigencies of fate to be thrifty, and I did not love the city with either maudlin or clear-eyed passion. But one thing London possesses in greater quantity than any other location in England, Scotland, or the Alliance of Ireland, and that is privacy. One rebuffs the avid curiosity of the country at one's peril, but city dwellers have so many more opportunities to pry among so many strangers whom they will never see again, that one missed chance is hardly worth the notice. This alone made London the inevitable answer to the question of where I would choose to dwell, no matter how uneasy the nameless ones made me as they swept silently through the streets or congregated, like rooks, on the underground platforms. No matter that regardless of how hard I pinched my pennies, they still seemed to slip through my fingers at a slightly faster rate each month. No matter that the obverse face of privacy is loneliness. I spoke to no one save the armed forces doctors, to whom I reported once a week to have my leg assessed, and they, uncomfortable with my presence, unable either to treat me simply as a patient or to bring themselves to treat me as a colleague, were ill at ease and only became more so as the weeks passed, and it became clear that, as so often with spectral injuries, my recovery was going to be less than complete. The leg would bear my weight, which indeed was more than I had hoped for when I first woke in Dr. Sylvester's tent, but it was sluggish, always dragging slightly no matter how I strove with it, and without my cane to lean on, I lurched rather than walked. Running was out of the question. I knew that bitterness was mere self-indulgence. I had chosen to join the medical corps knowing full well that something such as this could happen, even if I had stupidly believed it would never happen to me. And there was no sense in laying blame or holding on to this pointless anger. Better to pick myself up, whether literally or metaphorically, and go on from where I stood. And I had almost reconciled myself to doing so when my body finally recovered enough for the secondary effects to make themselves known. The sense of shame I felt when I woke that first morning, battered and aching and dizzy with dreams that were in truth memories, was literally nauseous. I lurched across my tiny room to the washstand and retched for what felt like hours, though I brought up nothing but ugly green bile. It was, in a way, a relief, for at least I knew I hadn't killed and eaten anything, or anyone. But I was physically miserable all that day, as well as terrified, for I had no idea whether I might change that night. I became more than ever determined to stay in London, and I said nothing to my doctors of this new development. But of course, the natural perversity of all things dictated that the more reasons I had to stay in London, the more beset with difficulties that prospect seemed to be. I could not afford London on my own, not with my health still so precarious that I could not hope to find regular employment, but finding someone to share lodgings seemed every bit as chimerical a goal. Although armed forces training made me at least capable of sharing my living space with another person, I harbored no illusions about the difficulties my temperament would make for anyone trying to share their living space with me. A natural tendency toward the autocratic had not been curbed by either my experiences as a surgeon or as a serving officer, and I had been accused more than once of being dour and pedantic and impossible to live with. Added to that were the new difficulties caused by and associated with my injury. Pain made me short-tempered, and I now had a large and ugly secret to hide. I had a good deal of practice in keeping secrets, but this one. At one point, I began making a list of the traits I should look for in a potential flatmate. Amiable was the first, dim-witted the second. I considered a moment, added, possibly deaf, and burst out laughing for the first time since Kandahar. The conundrum remained unresolved, my savings dwindling at an alarming rate, but not yet extinguished, on the day the doctors pronounced me healed, or as close as they thought me likely to come, and I decided on the strength of it to have a drink in the Criterion Bar, where once I had felt myself to be the ruler of all creation. "Oh, how the mighty have fallen," I said, saluting the indifferent bartender with my glass, and a voice behind me said incredulously, "Doyle? That's never Johnny Doyle." I swung around and cried, "Young Stamford," in disbelieving delight. Stamford, of course, was not young. He had been middle-aged when we struggled through human anatomy together, and he had to be nearly 60 now, any more than my name was Johnny. But the sophomoric humor of medical students had bestowed fitting sobriquets. Young Stamford, who was old enough to be our father, and Johnny, in retaliation for my refusal to reveal more of my given names than my initials. And it could have been much worse. Stamford and I shook hands, and he said, "Good gracious, Doyle, what have you been doing with yourself?" "I am only recently returned from Afghanistan," I said, "and I have been devoting my attention to the question of whether there is a man in London mad enough to share lodgings with me." I meant it mostly as a joke, for Stamford had known me well enough to appreciate it, but instead of laughing, he got a very odd expression on his face and said, "Do you know, you're the second person today to say that to me." "Who was the first?" His expression became assessing. "I'm not at all sure. But then you just might be cold-blooded enough to put up with him." "But who is this paragon? One of those terrifying German lecturers?" "Nothing like that," Stamford said cheerfully. He consulted his watch. "If you care to, you can come along and meet him, and it will spare me trying to explain." "I have nothing better to do," I said truthfully, and gripped my cane in preparation to follow wherever Stamford might choose to lead. Outside the Criterion, he hailed a hansom and told the driver, "St. Bartholomew's." "Bart's," I said when we were settled. "Are you teaching then?" He gave me a wry smile. The fate of any man who cannot afford a London practice and yet cannot bring himself to leave London. But it's not so bad. I like to think that I'm doing my part to save lives by improving the pool of available doctors. "I can almost guarantee you that you are," I said, and I told him stories of some of the so-called doctors I'd met in Afghanistan until we reached Bart's. Stamford led me to one of the chemistry laboratories. It was deserted except for a man hunched over a lab bench in the back of the room. As we came in, he straightened up, and my first puzzled thought was, why is he wearing an overcoat in here? But then, as he turned toward us, the overcoat flexed around him, spreading slightly before pulling back in, and I realized that it wasn't an overcoat at all, but a pair of wings, coal black, crow's wings. And man wasn't a man, but an angel. I looked at Stamford in confusion. "Is that the angel of St. Bartholomew's? I thought surely I remembered him? Oh, good Lord, no." But before he could explain, the angel was striding toward us, his wings spreading and mantling around him. "Human blood," he said. "I need a drop of human blood." "Oh, no, you don't," Stamford said, putting his hands protectively behind his back. "If you're turning vampire, I don't want any part of it." "Don't be ridiculous," the angel said, and turned his attention to me. He was tall but slight built, with an angel's long, light bones. His complexion was marble white, his hair white and as fine as a child's, and his eyes so pale that they seemed transparent and lit from within, although nothing could have been farther from the terrible light of the fallen's eyes. He wore a subdued fog-gray suit. "Human blood," he said again. He had a lovely voice, clear and measured, and perfect enunciation. "I only need a drop. I promise it isn't for occult purposes of any kind." "Then why do you want it?" I said. Stamford said, "Don't get him started." The angel hunched both shoulder and wing, which quite effectively created a barrier between Stamford and the two of us, and said, "It's a question of stains, you see." "Stains?" said I. "Yes. After a few days, the police have no means of determining whether a particular stain, say on a shirt cuff, is blood or rust or perhaps paint, and they can't distinguish between human blood and animal blood at all. I'm working to find a reagent that will change color in the presence of hemoglobin, but not in the presence of other similarly colored substances. I think I've got it, but I can't test it without a drop of human blood. He looked at me beseechingly. I saw that despite the looming darkness of his wings, which made him look taller, we were very much of a height. It was a bizarre request, but not an unreasonable one, even if it did seem oddly personal, and no matter what the metaphysicum morbi had done to me, I was still human. All right, I said, but I want to watch this test of yours. His smile made his rather beaky face quite beautiful. Of course. Here, I have a clean bodkin just over here. He did not actually grab my hand to drag me across the laboratory, but it was obviously a very near-run thing. Here, a beaker and a liter of distilled water. Here, your finger and the bodkin. Just a drop, really. I was being accurate. And I've got a bit of sticking plaster ready. His enthusiasm was weirdly touching, and more than a little contagious. I pricked my finger and pressed a drop of blood into his beaker, then applied the sticking plaster and watched as he stirred the water vigorously until the blood was invisible. There, he said, undetectable. But now, if we just... He picked up a small phial from the bench. Its contents were equally colorless, and when he tipped a drop into the beaker, it looked at first as if he had simply added water to water. Come on, he muttered, stirring vigorously once again. Then the liquid clouded up, and as we watched, a bluish-green sediment began to precipitate in the bottom of the beaker. Blood! The angel shrieked in delight, and behind us, where I had forgotten about him, Stanford laughed. Thank you.